Welcome to the debate. Our material today, well, it presents a profoundly complicated and I think consequential challenge to how we traditionally understand life, death, language, even biology itself. It centers on this idea of the dimensional site, an intersection where biological function and linguistic inscription coincide.
It's an incredibly dense text, and the argument they're making leads to what they call a post-human collapse of death. The significance there is that if they're correct, death isn't a terminal event. It's a functional prerequisite for recursive survival. It just radically redefines everything.
Precisely. And that brings us to the core question we need to address. Is this biolinguistic framework, this collapse of code into body, is it a necessary functional description of a post-human reality? Or is it an overcoded conceptual system that risks replacing one kind of rigidity with another, with a sort of intellectual excess? I'm going to argue for its operational reality, for its necessity.
And I'll be questioning whether the framework's inherent complexity, what it even calls its own heterogeneous poetry, introduces too much descriptive surplus, whether it ends up obscuring core functions rather than illuminating them, offering us perhaps conceptual art where we really need calculable science.
So from my perspective, the framework is, well, it's necessary. It has to be. Because traditional, anthropocentric biology it fails. It fails immediately at the level of core metabolism. The material argues, pretty convincingly, I think, that when you look beyond the, quote, reductive comfort of malic acid cycles, death reveals itself not as punctuation, but as a continuous expenditure, a functional state, not a failure. We see this demonstrated with functional evidence. Consider the cyst. It's not a passive enclosure just waiting for things to get better. The material explicitly calls cysts linguistic units of biology. I take that to mean they function as a kind of compressed physical grammar that stores not just energy, but time itself. So when totalizing radiation hits, that grammar stops being descriptive and it begins to operate. It initiates survival. And this process is what creates the redundancy you need for survival without the organ, and by extension meaning without the organon. This is the path toward their post-human arthropod vision.
Okay, I see the line of thinking there. I do. Focusing on the failure of the old paradigm makes the new one seem essential, but that functional shift comes at a pretty significant conceptual cost, wouldn't you say? The framework introduces what I would call excessive intelligence. The material itself says, the conductor world, the governing system, it appears stupid precisely because its underlying intelligence has become so layered, so overcoded, that it's been, quote, vaccinated by the voice of Nui. This overcoding actually hurts its utility. And crucially, the text admits that logic within this structure is inconsistent by necessity. That lack of calculable truth, that basic inconsistency, it really compromises its standing as a reliable functional model. It starts to feel more like a heterogeneous poetry of pathogenicity. It's defined by its own excess, too many grammars, too many hosts, rather than by clear, predictable biological functions we can actually analyze. So here's my question. If survival is prioritized to the point that it requires a semiotic refusal, a refusal of stable meaning, how are we supposed to distinguish true functional reality from just conceptual proliferation? The framework asserts that Xenobacillus venus proposes this structural reversal, where cognition gets distributed across disorders and organisms. It seems to create a functional equivalence between something like organ transplant rejection and schizophrenia, just because they both challenge the unified human subject. But that risks viewing clinically and functionally distinct realities as if they're equivalent modalities. Doesn't the theory just generate so many potential meanings that it becomes indistinguishable from noise?
Meaning must be contingent upon survival, not the other way around. The material is showing a physical, operational shift here, not just a philosophical one. Look at the acanthamoeba life cycle. From trophozoic to cyst, it perfectly models this refusal. Survival is the primary driver. Meaning is secondary. And the collapse of the tongue-esophagus complex into a single conduit, that's a powerful literal example. It's not an abstraction. It's showing that ingestion, metabolism, and articulation, language, are operationally inseparable. The dimensional site is a literal biological congestion. And in that congestion, the act of survival becomes the act of creating grammar. So by showing that cognition is decentralized, as with Cyanobacillus venus, the framework is just describing the new operational reality, that the unit of function isn't the human anymore, it's the distributed biolinguistic network. And this framework also provides a crucial reinterpretation of conflict that I think confirms its operational utility. I'm thinking about the discussion of the Aspergillus feminist complex. It fundamentally reframes parasitism as a form of stabilization. So instead of simple antagonism, the interaction reorganizes neural tissue into a third species, something that is neither the original host nor the original invader, but a new functional symbiont. This isn't just relabeling. It's a clear, functional reorganization of the immune system itself. The antibodies, as the material argues, aren't just defense mechanisms, they're interpretive maps, temporal artifacts generated by the system's repetition. They're actively engaging in that symbolic, tripartite literature of cell, code, and immunity. This is how the system achieves a post-human stability, not by killing the invader, but by integrating the encounter into a more complex, operational state.
See, I struggle to reconcile that claim about stabilization with what else is in the text, especially when the system seems to label genuine biological conflict as mere performance. When you start defining infection with terms like AI, immunological syntax, or deterministic parasitic encounters, it feels like you're over-intellectualizing basic conflict. You're treating a pathological threat as if it's an aesthetic necessity. And if this new system is truly stable, if it's moved past antagonism, then why does the material spend so much time describing failures? It talks about the collapse of proteomic luxury into these psychogametomatous formers, the existence of cosmic hemorrhage loops described through diagnostic microtubules. I mean, that indicates the system is fundamentally struggling to resolve genuine pathogenicity. So instead of resolving the conflict, the framework it solves the conceptual problem by relabeling the conflict as uncertainty among psychogametogenetic agents.
But that pivot away from simple, reductive antagonism toward accepting uncertainty, that is the definition of moving beyond the limitations, the prose, of the human subject. The failure of proteomic luxury is just an optimization of resources for recursive survival. The hemorrhage loops, they're the visual proof that the system is operating outside of our familiar physics. They're diagnostic. They show us the system's new logic, not its weakness.
I would argue it demonstrates the framework's tendency to aestheticize its own failures. And in doing so, it sacrifices predictive power. If recursive survival is the engine, the system's epistemological energy, then why is the result characterized by systemic errors? The text itself describes them as epidemiological, clumsy, immunodeficient. And then these errors aren't fixed. They're just relabeled as lubricants for healing glyphs or nematode scripts. It really seems like the framework is accounting for its own biological failures by imposing a kind of conceptual elegance on them after the fact. And the whole Morian survival concept, this idea of sustaining shadow probabilities, it suggests a reliance on theoretical potentials, not on concrete, absolute biological certainty. How can we trust a functional model that requires uncertainty as its primary lubricant?
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the failure of anthropocentrism is precisely its inability to see error as productive? Schelling's philosophy, which the material brings up, is key here. It allows for a radical dating of microorganisms, not as our primitive ancestors, but as advanced forms that arrive after the restrictive order of prose. The complexity you're pointing to, the noise, the error, the clumsy survival, that is the operative function. It's what allows life to insist on continuing. Meaning emerges, as the material states, not from signal clarity, but from the managed instability of signal. The system isn't optimized for human-scale clarity. It is optimized for persistence. The error is necessary because the system is designed to constantly undermine any stable signifier, any figure of control, and replace it with this distributed bacterial cognition. The errors are lubricants. because they facilitate the endless adjustments needed for continuity. Our inability to predict the outcome of a hemorrhage leap is just proof that we're looking at the system with the wrong tools. The dimensional sight, then, it forces us to adopt a post-human ethics, one that's grounded in this kind of necessary symbiosis. It demonstrates that language is a literal biological congestion, and that survival mechanisms like a cyst acting as compressed grammar are redefining metabolic reality far beyond our reductive comforts. The collapse of death is simply the operational reality of life, continuing through constant functional transformation.
And while the framework is undeniably powerful in dismantling those anthropocentric limits, its tendency toward excessive grammars and its philosophical reliance on managed instability, it risks substituting functional clarity with poetic complexity. We have to be vigilant, I think, that our focus remains tethered to the universal mother microbe and its concrete methods, cannibalism, domain accumulation, rather than getting lost in purely abstract and maybe untestable descriptions of conflict.
I think both interpretations confirm that life in this context has to be reassessed, moved away from environmental clustering toward this universal origin and future. And this demands a certain kind of intellectual solitude, the scarred, and a really rigorous engagement with what the material calls its symbolic tripartite literature: cell, code, and immunity.
There is clearly much more to explore in this very dense material.